Welcome to the fourth review. Welcome, students. Noisy students. Welcome. 4 of 5 Change You sessions starts tonight. Thank you so much for being here. We're happy that it's actually sunny again with no snow. Yay! Spring is around the corner. I would like to start with a little bit more serious topic. I had a student ask me if I would address a loss in our community. And I said I absolutely would, but I would like to talk about that in terms of context and also from my own personal experience. Yesterday, we lost an icon in the LGBT movement, and that was Elizabeth Taylor. In the early 80s, to rewind a bit, I was living in the Bay Area. So, you know, it was definitely a time of intensity and a time of horror, actually. And it was the mid-80s that I lost a friend of mine that I had known since I was 7 years old. Bruce. When I moved out of the projects to a real neighborhood with houses, he was the first person to befriend me. And in the mid-80s, I lost him. And then maybe 18 months later, I lost my friend Christopher, who was a friend from college, a dear, beautiful person who was about the age of my own son, his age right now. And then a couple of years went by, and I thought that my dear, just absolutely beloved friend David had made it through the scourge and was safe, and we lost him as well. So it was 3 years, 3 very dear friends, but I can't really describe to you the kind of terror that people were living in at that time. And also the degree of shame that people carried around. When my dear friend Marlene told me that we had lost my first friend Bruce, she said it to me in a whisper. And that's how we talked about AIDS at that time. There was so much shame, you know, shame on us for using a whisper, but that's how it was at that time. A friend of mine, actually one of my professors from graduate school, still a very dear friend of mine, lost 27 friends in 18 months. And it was a time when if you were gay and you had a spot on your hand, you thought it was a death sentence. You just didn't know. Not only did we lose a generation of the community, but we lost the ability to transmit culture and history to the next generation. It suffered a huge blow as a result of all those losses. During that time, the Reagan administration was stone cold silent on the issue. Gary Bauer, who would go on to lead the Family Research Council, which is really a cornerstone in the anti-gay industry, and funded heavily by our own neighbors in the West Michigan area, was Reagan's domestic policy advisor at that time. And he kept the U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop away from the president. In the book, Faith in the Halls of Power, How Evangelicals Joined the American Elite, author D. Michael Lindsay discusses the problems that the Surgeon General had when he was asked to draft a report on AIDS for the president. And I quote, "In 1986, President Reagan asked the Surgeon General to prepare a report on AIDS as the United States confirmed its 10,000th case. Leaders of the evangelical movement did not want Koop to write the report, nor did senior White House staffers. As Dr. Koop related to me, quote, Gary Bauer, Reagan's chief advisor on domestic policy, was my nemesis in Washington because he kept me from the president. He kept me from the cabinet, and he set up a wall of enmity between me and most of the people that surrounded Reagan because he believed that anybody who had AIDS ought to die with it. That was God's punishment for them." And President Reagan, who has been termed the great communicator, waited 7 years from the onset of the epidemic before he ever mentioned the word AIDS in a public speech. At that point, over 50,000 lives had been lost. 2 years later, when he left office, over 100,000 people were dead. And 2 years after he left office, over 1 million Americans were infected with HIV. But during this period of deadly silence, one person emerged as a fierce ally to the LGBT community, and it was Elizabeth Taylor, a classic movie star, dripping in privilege of every kind. She was bigger than life. Dripping with diamonds, too. Remember that about her. She was beautiful. She had those violet eyes. How does that even happen? And, Academy Awards and men and marriages, and she had it all. And she used her voice and that privilege to call attention to the epidemic. She hosted the first fundraiser for AIDS care and research in 1984. And she also engaged other celebrities such as Michael Jackson and Elton John in the cause. She raised awareness, she implored Congress to provide funds for patient care, and she raised over $100 million to fund AIDS research, and that was where the bulk of the money came from. So we lost a woman, an icon, who used her privilege to give voice to people who were horrendously marginalized. Now, all of us have some degree of privilege. We're in this beautiful space. We have an opportunity to eat this great food. We're safe. We can voice disparaging comments about a previous administration and not worry about our safety. We all have privilege. And the question is, for us who want to go out and change the world, is how to manage that privilege in service to others. And there are really 3 ways that I want to call attention to tonight, just to honor her memory. And the first way is to exercise our privilege, to use it. And we see that Elizabeth Taylor did this. She exploited that voice, that mega voice that she had, and she provided access as a result of her privilege. So you can exercise your privilege. You can also relinquish your privilege. And an example of that for me is in our culture, people assume that you're heterosexual. So in my work, people often want to know, why would I be doing this work? I often hear the term, word on the street is, questioning my sexual orientation. And I am careful never to answer the question, but always to leave the ambiguity out there and to relinquish that assumption of heterosexuality and the privilege that goes with that. If I don't do that, then the message that I send is, I'm all for equality for the LGBT community, but I'm not one of them. So we can exercise our privilege, we can relinquish our privilege, and we can also renounce our privilege. And we do that by not engaging, by boycotting organizations and institutions which are discriminatory. For example, straight people can renounce marriage, very heterosexist institution. It's a powerful way to express our commitment to equality. Currently, we have over 30 states that ban marriage equality in some way. What if all the straight married people started getting divorces? Think that might change the culture a little bit? I think it just might. So we all have some kind of privilege. There's white privilege, male privilege, able-bodied privilege, we have class privilege, our citizenship status is a privilege, and they can all be leveraged in service to someone else. The thing is, when we move from the center, where we enjoy that privilege, out to the margins, where we give it up, where we relinquish it, where we renounce it, it can be scary. It can feel scary. We can be afraid that there might be loss. There might actually be loss. It feels like something. But it's the right thing to do. And Elizabeth Taylor certainly showed us that you can have enormous impact in giving voice, in being in service to people who are marginalized. So I just take this moment to acknowledge a ferocious ally. And thank you for letting me do that. Moving on.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Now on to some housekeeping. If we're going to talk about housekeeping, we should definitely talk about bathrooms, don't you think? That's usually where the housekeeping lies. So as far as bathrooms, I want to clarify that we have female, male bathroom. We also upstairs have a unisex bathroom, which use it, alternate it. We will wait for you to be done, so there's no rush. Don't worry, we'll wait until everyone is accommodated. So no anxiety around bathrooms, we're all good. Also, I wanted to create an opportunity for you to connect with the good work that you're doing. So I've created a folder on Wigio called Our Community. And I uploaded a document there about the LGBT Resource Center, just as an example. It's totally an example. Do whatever you want to do about your own organization or whatever campaign or movement that you're working on. But it's an opportunity for you to share about the work that you're doing and how we can support that work, how we can become involved. And also for you to take a look at the work that your participants, your fellow participants are doing to see how you might support that as well. So I invite you to look on Wigio at the Our Community folder and please share all the good work that you're involved in. So now I would like to bring back our beloved Lisa Weiner-Mafus to lead out session 4 and to introduce Reverend Rebecca Voelkel, whom I've known now for about 4 years. Our paths have crossed many times, and it's always a joy for me to sit at Rebecca's feet and learn from her and her wisdom. So please welcome Lisa back.
Oh, it's so great to be back here. Another installment of Change You. Looking forward to tonight's discussion. And I get the wonderful honor of introducing my good friend, Reverend Rebecca Voelkel. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Reverend Rebecca Voelkel, an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, is the director of the Institute for Welcoming Resources at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Before coming to the task force, she served as the interim national coordinator for the United Church of Christ Coalition for LGBT Concerns, as a pastor for Spirit of the Lakes United Church of Christ, and as program staff for the Center for Prevention on Sexual and Domestic Violence. Rebecca is the author of Preventing Sexual Abuse, a course of study for teenagers, as well as numerous articles and sermons which have appeared in such journals as Spirit Currents, the Journal of Religion and Abuse, Creating Change, and Parenting for Peace and Justice. She is a faith-based community organizer, trainer, and is a workshop presenter on a wide variety of faith-based and social justice topics. She is a graduate of Earlham, is that right? Earlham, okay. College and Yale Divinity School, and is currently working towards a Doctor of Ministry at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Reverend Voelkel is a theologian, pastor, organizer, and she has devoted her life's ministry to following Jesus' command to minister in partnership with, quote, the least among us, ones whom society has deemed outcast, unclean, or unworthy. This commitment constantly challenges her to ground her thinking and her acting in real-life situations that make real-life differences. As a way to balance her spiritual life, Rebecca is also a runner. Very true, she's a great runner. Talk to her about marathons, people. A hiker, biker, and avid community builder, spending time with friends and family as often as she can. She has a partner, Maggie, who's wonderful, and a beautiful daughter, Shannon, who's now 3. This says, 4, sorry. This says 1. Gotta update, sister. But she's really fabulous. And so I'm really glad that Rebecca's here to talk tonight. We've done a lot of work together, a lot of very complicated work together. We spoke this afternoon about the work that we do bridging secular and faith communities and doing racial justice work together. And so I'm really thrilled that you're here, and thank you for coming from Minneapolis to be with us. I want to tell you a little bit about the format of tonight before I welcome Rebecca with us. She's going to talk a bit And then there's going to be some tabletop conversation. We have some pretty, I think, engaging questions that she's going to introduce at different points in her presentation, and it's going to give you all an opportunity to talk together. So there'll be periods of her talking and periods of you talking. And then I also just want to let you know that her PowerPoint that she's about to present will be up on Wigio as well, right after the presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce my good friend, Reverend Voelkel.
Oh, your cell phones, please. Turn them silent.
Put them on silent, somebody's phone, yes, I'm glad to say it's not mine. Well, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you. It really is, honestly, a daunting experience to stand up here and look at all of your beautiful faces. And Lisa and Colette and I have been having conversation over the last number of weeks and months in preparation for my being here. And the whole experiment that is Change You and what you all are engaged in, I have to say, is so exciting. And I really am honored to be with you. And so I'm going to share a little bit. In fact, Colette, in some ways, where did you end up? There you are. Your introduction about the work that Elizabeth Taylor did, and you know, the indirect description of the horror that anti-LGBT religious organizing is and does, in some ways was, unfortunately, a really nice segue to what I'm going to be talking about this evening, and that is that I think we can all talk about examples of what Colette was referring to, the ways in which their religious ideology, faith, and practice have been used to commit unspeakable atrocities across the course of history. And I don't want to have anything that I'm about to say minimize that. The primary focus of my presentation, however, is going to be on the fact that there are also been communities of liberation and resistance and fabulousness that are religiously grounded also throughout the course of history. And so I want to talk, that's going to be the focus of what I'd like to say, and share a little bit about my own experience of pro-LGBT religious organizing, but I've been asked to try and not be narrowly defined around pro-LGBT, but rather kind of religiously based justice work in general. And so I'm hopeful to both reference some particularities, but also I hope that I have done enough to make this applicable widely. So as I was sort of brought up in the liberation theology context. And so given that, one of the wisdoms of the liberation theology movement is the importance of setting one's context. And so I want to just tell a little bit, want to reference some of the examples of liberative, religiously based justice work, and share a little bit about my own context that brings me here. So there's a really wonderful book that I would suggest to you called Gandhi and Jesus, The Saving Power of Nonviolence. And just to give you a few examples from the 20th century to sort of back up my suggestion that in fact there have been religiously rooted liberation and justice movements across time, but particularly in the 20th century, Terence Rinn references 4 that I would direct your attention to if you get an opportunity to study them. The Solidarity movement in Poland, the movement to oust Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and the civil rights movement here in the United States. And the premise of his book is really that the Gandhian and Jesus philosophy was both woven into the philosophy of those movements and the practice of those movements. And that it really went back to the use of nonviolent direct action, whose core is really the understanding that it's critically important in whatever justice movement you're engaged in to structure and focus your work in ways that recognize and hearken to, if you will, the humanity in both those who are oppressed by a system and those who at least ostensibly seem to be benefiting from the system, those who are oppressors. And part of the Gandhian Jesus philosophy that he lifts up is the reality that oppression is distorting of all who live in its midst, even those who appear to be benefiting from it. And if we can craft our actions in nonviolent direct means that really lift up the humanity of all involved, the potential for genuine transformation that doesn't backlash into violence upon violence is critical. That was really this notion of religiously rooted justice work. I was raised on that. I sort of came out of the womb being taught that. I just want to share one story, and that is both of my grandparents on my mother's side are Scottish immigrants. And at the age of 14, my grandfather was working in the coal mines. He started when he was 10. And he was in the mine, and there was an accident in which 22 men were trapped. He was one of 3 to make it out alive. But he didn't make it out unscathed. He literally had a huge scar down the back, down his back, that he carried with him in his entire life. But it was also a metaphorical scar of the impact of greed and lack of opportunity and a system of injustice in Scotland. And he got out as soon as he absolutely could and immigrated to this country when he was 16 and literally never went back, and brought with him this understanding. He was a staunch Scottish Presbyterian, but he brought with him the understanding that his religious faith necessitated that he be, if we say that God loves all people and that there is that of God within each person, then we ought to make the world more reflective of the kind of justice that has equal access for all. And my grandmother, very much the same way. And I was reared by my Grammy, as I called her. She, at 14, was working as a domestic in Scotland. And the young woman who was, I think, perhaps 15, maybe a year older than she, asked her to come and literally wipe her ass. And my grandmother told her what she thought about that, and she was promptly fired. And she came to this country, and the 2 of them raised my mother, who raised me, in a household, and I come from a very Christian tradition, but there was God, Jesus, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was the New Deal and working people, the rights for working people. And again, I can't overemphasize the ways in which the synergy between religious belief and this understanding of how the world ought to be, and the impulse and the responsibility to be making the world reflective of those beliefs. So anyway, well, I'll tell you one other thing. So in my own life, and Lisa, why don't you flip to the next? This is more a note for myself than it is for any of you all. On the other side of my family, at least if family lore is correct, I'm the 17th generation of pastor. It's kind of a genetic disorder in our family. Just one other example is that when I was I think 14 years old before I tasted my first grape. Because I'm not sure if you remember the United Farm Workers grape boycott, but that was just a concrete example of literally that the food we ate on our table needed to be reflective of our religious and political values. So and so it was into this context that I came out as a lesbian. Folks, Lisa and I often joke about, particularly conservative folks, but progressive ones as well, when I say I am both lesbian and pastor, there is this kind of baffled look, and sometimes people are like, but you can't be. Well, in fact, I am. So that's part of the context that allows me to hold both of those, what seem like contradictory identities, in this one body. And it's into that, this conversation that I bring myself. So I'm going to do a little bit of reflecting on what I see as kind of the religious landscape in which we're doing our work. And then I'm going to invite you to do a little reflecting in your small groups. This topic of a complex religious landscape, I mean, literally we could spend the next, 10 weeks talking about this. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that I am just scratching the surface, but I hope it's suggestive enough to let you kind of play with it. But part of what I do in my life is convene circles of pro-LGBT religious leaders. And I just want you to know that there is, in every single religious tradition you can think of, there are folks doing pro-LGBT work. And there is an incredible complexity because of the ways in which race and culture and ethnicity are so interwoven with religious identity and religious practice. I was talking earlier today about, I work with 4 different pro-LGBT Jewish organizations, and the nuances of working within Reform Judaism versus conservative Judaism versus Orthodox Judaism. I mean, even within Judaism, there is this level of nuance and complexity. And certainly the example of working within Pentecostal Christianity is radically different than working within mainline Protestant Christianity. And knowing those nuances is extremely important. And because of that, the organizing philosophy that we operate with, and that I would offer to you to chew over and push back at me if it doesn't land right on you. But we really have a philosophy that's extraordinarily important because of this nuance and complexity, that the strategy include figuring out ways to work with indigenous religious leadership. That is to say, I work very closely with Bishop Yvette Flunder. I don't know if folks know Bishop Flunder, but she's the presiding bishop of the Fellowship, which is a association of about 40,000, mostly African American, same-gender loving Pentecostals. And for me, who comes out of a very sort of frozen, chosen, mainline Protestant denomination, to try and walk into a Pentecostal context and try and raise issues, you can see the ridiculousness of it. But that's true across religious traditions, and there's a kind of street cred that you really need in terms of being indigenous to a particular religious community to be raising issues. And so this kind of the importance of indigenous religious leadership and the sort of concurrent cultural competency to do the work, which allows you to have a very tailored approach. Just one example, I'm working right now with a circle of leaders who are experimenting, trying to respond to the fact that during the Proposition 8 campaign in California, there are 900 welcoming and affirming congregations in California. And yet, in terms of working on the Proposition 8 campaign, some minute, percentage of those welcoming congregations actually did anything around Proposition 8. A few Jewish congregations, most of the Unitarians, God bless them, a couple of UCC congregations, a couple of Episcopal congregations, but for the most part, the vast majority of congregations didn't do anything. And part of that was we're experimenting with how do we have a tailored approach, to help people understand why being welcoming within your congregation might relate to making public witness on a particular secular political issue. Well, convincing Lutherans to do that draws on a particular tradition in a particular way that's very different than trying to convince conservative Jews to do that. And so you can understand the kind of tailored approaches that are necessary and the kind of references and cultural reference that is necessary to do that. All right, can I do the next slide? Another piece that is, we touched a little bit upon this this afternoon as well, is I think it's wise to recognize, Karen Armstrong in her book, A History of God, has written quite, I think, eloquently of this, to not be naive to the role of fundamentalism, at least within the 3 monotheistic traditions, and understanding the impact and to tailor one's organizing with that in mind. The other piece that's extremely important is this piece about multi-faith organizing. One of the pieces that Lisa and I spent a lot of time talking about is when one is doing organizing, and the importance of finding folks who are indigenous leaders, as we talked about, who have a lot of strength within their community. Those folks don't necessarily have the gifts and graces to be bridge builders to other communities. And so recognizing that when one is doing kind of secular religious partnering, the folks who are the strong kind of intra-community leaders are not necessarily the same people who are, you know, God bless them. I keep picking on my Lutheran colleagues, but I have a couple of Lutheran colleagues who I just cannot take to multi-faith contexts, for instance. They embarrass themselves and me. And the importance of building up a leadership base of folks who are able to be bridge builders is really critically important. And then just one last piece on this, and that is that, you know, as I talked to my multi-faith, in fact, when we did a debrief of the Proposition 8 campaign from a religious perspective, we were laughing across the room that a lot of times it is so much easier to hang out across religious traditions with folks who share a kind of radical or progressive perspective than it is to hang out with your own co-religionists who are fundamentalists. You know, it's just you know, the earnestness in the room can sometimes drag you down. So that sort of hanging out with folks who share a progressive or radical analysis can be a lot more fun. And I think this next slide, just some of the fun, just to let you know, as I think I've shared some of this already, but the landscape of pro-LGBT religious work is extraordinarily exciting. And, you know, I think one of the things that we might be talking about later on today is, you know, what does that look like on the local level here? But I want you to know that there is this large, both ecumenical within Christianity and multi-faith and different sort of ecumenical collaborations within a variety of faith traditions. And one thing that's really a fun statistic is in 2005, we had about 1,300 welcoming and affirming Christian and Unitarian congregations. And to date, we're over 4,000 welcoming congregations. So that the infrastructure within the Christian and Unitarian traditions is really expanding rapidly. The other piece is that we're very close to completing a welcoming synagogue project to be launched within the 5 major movements of Judaism, and really excited about that as well. And just in terms of this context, I wanted to share with you, I think many of you know this, but just in case not, there's a relatively new group, the last, I think, 4, maybe 5 years, called Room for All. Are people familiar with Room for All? Its primary work is within the Reformed Church in America, although I was actually here about a year ago for a training with them that included a number of Christian Reformed folks as well. So as we get down to concrete strategies for this area, I wanted to share that. Okay, so the next slide is going to ask us, hold on for one sec before we do that, is going to ask us to break into small groups and have a little bit of conversation. But before I do that, let me ask a bio question. Is now the time to have a bio break? Going to the bathroom, that's what I mean by a bio break. Or should we do our small groups and then have a bio break? Small groups?
Yeah.
Okay, I see a couple of people who absolutely have to go now. I'll let you do that. But we'll do the small, let me tell you before you run what the question is. So go ahead. So what I'd like you to do is, on your own, for about 5 minutes, I'd like you to do just some self-reflective writing about what is the most important lesson you've learned from organizing within or with religious communities. So spend some time on your own answering that question. And I'll give you the heads up when that 5 minutes is over. And then if you can serve your small your table and talk for about 10 minutes. All right, it should be very quiet in here while people are writing. I invite us to move our many conversations into one conversation. I hope I should take it as a good sign that it's hard to close off a small group conversation. So just so you know, we will have time. I think we're going to have 2 or 3 more small group breakouts. And my hope is over the course of the day that, over the evening, that, you know, it's really going to be each of our goals to try and take what I'm saying and really concretize and contextualize it into your contexts. All right, well that was kind of grounding us in some of the pro-liberation and justice religious work. I want to share the next chunk of stuff is really, I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Lisa and Beth Zemsky and other sort of movement-building wonks who have shared kind of movement-building theory and trying to weave it with some of the religious organizing that I have done. So I'm going to share just a little bit of kind of theory, and then we'll hopefully move to a phase of really applying that. We'll go to the next slide. So the first thing I just want to kind of make, this perhaps is too stark of a separation, but I want to distinguish between cultural power and political power. And the reason I want to do that is that much of the work that I do is focused on, I know folks have heard about the 3-pegged stool of homo and transphobia, bi and transphobia. There are, the one peg of the stool is illegality, the other peg is sickness, and the third peg is sin. And that's a concrete example around LGBT issues, but it's true in other movements as well. And we've done relatively well on the illegality and sickness realm around LGBT issues. But I'm here to tell you that the sin is alive and well, and that in much the same way that we have the movement to change racist laws has been largely successful, racism is alive and well in our country. And if we don't shift cultural context and cultural power and systemic issues, then we're not going to have a prayer. And likewise around LGBT issues, that the work is critical, and don't get me wrong, the work to change public policy, to change laws, all of that is critical work. But unless it is accompanied and really draws from the wisdom of cultural change, I think it draws us far short of the societal transformation that we envision. So I just want to distinguish between those two kinds of power. The other piece that I want to talk quite a bit about is, again, sort of draws from the Grassroots Policy Project, is this notion that to build any successful movement, it is critical that there are 3 interrelated component parts. And I want to be clear that this is not a linear theory. It is very circular and interwoven. And those 3 component parts that are necessary for a healthy and successful movement. And I would argue that sort of the raison d'etre, or the reason for being of this body, is are we building a radical progressive movement in this part of Michigan and the world? At least as I've heard you talk, that's what I've heard you all are about. And so the 3 component parts, the first is actually known as the third face of power. These are sort of known as the 3 faces of power. I like to start with the third face of power, and that is the creation of and dissemination of a worldview. And I would sort of shorthand that of what is your vision of the way the world ought to be? The second is the second phase of power is the infrastructure building. You know, what are the organizations and the capacity within the movement to actually create the kind of change that you want to see? And then the third phase of power, actually the first phase of power, the third one that I'm talking about, is this ability to mobilize large numbers of people, to do campaigns, to get large folks at the, Lisa often uses the experience of Bayard Rustin helping to organize the March on Washington in 1963. Like the ability to gather huge numbers of people for collective action. I'm just gonna, the next 3 slides are just sort of talking a little bit about each of these. So the piece that I want to just add is the wisdom of movement building organizing, when you do organizing through a movement building lens, is that every opportunity, whatever phase of power you're working in, is an opportunity to bring in the other 2 phases of power. So for instance, if we are engaged in a campaign, if you will, how is it that we're making sure that the action we take during that particular campaign is building the relationship and the trust and the coalition, i.e. the infrastructure of the movement, and how is it that every opportunity we have in a campaign is an opportunity to share our worldview. And every conversation, every ad, like that, we're constantly disseminating our worldview. I'll give you a negative example, and that is the radical right. In the early 1980s, the Moral Majority was founded in 1979, and kind of those large religious right organizations spent the early 80s running candidates for school boards across the country. I think many of you know that. And you know, a lot of us thought, like, what are these people doing? You know, it's just ridiculous. But they knew they weren't going to win the campaign, but they used that campaign to build their list of people, and every single time they spoke publicly, they used that opportunity to sort of disseminate their view of how the world ought to be. And you know, I feel like we have been the victims of really, really successful movement building strategy on the right. And you know, we were talking earlier today about, you know, you can either bemoan that or learn some lessons from it. And certainly, I think they have done brilliant movement building strategy. Next slide. This is dense, and as Lisa said, you'll get the whole PowerPoint. But really, the piece about the infrastructure building is this: do we have organizations across the movement that know one another, that are working in coalition, and do those individual organizations have capacity to actually do what they hope to do? And are they organized and structured around the worldview that they say that they are espousing? And I think I've already talked about mass mobilization. The only thing I would say is, I don't want to go too far down the road that I'm about to, the can of worms that I'm about to open up, but you know, we talk a lot about sort of critiquing the way in which a lot of campaigns happen on the left, and that that campaigns are run as if they are not related to or connected to this movement building endeavor. And in fact, at the end of the campaign, we all hate each other instead of, even if we've lost, we at least have this sense of solidarity with one another, and our relationships are deeper, and we've used in fact, we never want to see the person we just spent, you know, 18 hours a day with for the last, you know, 17 weeks. And there's something wrong with that. And in fact, part of the context out of which I come is trying to take some of the movement building theory and the organizing theory and use it in the context of congregations. So sort of helping congregations move through a welcoming process. And one of the realities of that is, you know, the philosophy that our campaigns are focused on 50% plus one can be destructive in community. Because at the end of the day, even if I win, if 49.99999% of my community have been demonized or demoralized by my actions, you're not able to live together as a community going forward. And I realize that it's slightly different in work in a kind of a geographic community. But I do think that, this kind of goes back to that sort of Gandhian Jesus philosophy, that if every step along the way is detracting from the humanity of, quote unquote, your opponent, and then you hope that after the election is done, y'all are gonna be able to sort of be proud about being, fellow citizens of Grand Rapids, there's something, askew in that. And so I would just lift up that again, I don't want to make it sound Pollyanna or naive, but there's something sort of, I think, of deep spiritual wisdom that really calls us to think about our kind of mass mobilization and campaign work in ways that are really about building up and not solely about winning and beating our opponent in very small, narrowly defined ways. Is that clear? Okay. Okay, next slide. So, I suck at PowerPoint. So this is a really bad slide. But you have no idea how long it took me to make it, so I'm showing it to you. I tried to have it look like a wave. I tried to have it be different colors. No. The fact that it has words on it is purely a testament to my perseverance. So I want to really credit Beth Zemsky, and I know that Lisa's going to go into a lot more depth about this the next time you all are together. And my experience is I've had this presentation about 18 times, and I learned something every time. So I don't think I'm stealing Lisa's thunder for next time. But I would recommend an article to you that Beth Zemsky and David Mann wrote called Building Organizations That Build the Movement. Building organizations in a movement moment. Building organizations in a movement moment. And I will try and
We'll get it.
Yes. What's it called?
We'll get it.
Wikio.
Actually, Piggly Wiggly.
Piggly Wiggly. Wow.
Suzanne coined that.
I see. Piggly Wiggly. I like that better. That makes me feel like I'm going to the grocery store.
Easier to remember.
That's right. So this slide is about worldview. This is an analysis of the third face of power. And the theory is that there is an inverse relationship. If I was a better PowerPoint person, let me just show you how it would go. This would, go like this, and this would go like this, and it's an ongoing, it's waves. That's what it's supposed to be, not it's just, yeah. And the theory is that and again, this is about worldview, that there are about 30 to 40 year waves around what is the dominant worldview that's out there, and how prominent is the worldview. And so the last progressive movement, this is probably the 30s, and then midway up is about 1948 with the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And at the top of this wave is between 1964 and 1968, when asked in exit polling after those presidential elections what the #1 issue was in our country, both in 1964 and in 1968, the #1 response was rights. So this is where the sort of the vision of human rights, of rights, really was peaking. By 1972, it was #8. By 1976, it was off the list. So you can kind of see this frame, this worldview of rights, and under this sort of meta, sort of progressive way, the LGBT rights movement, the women's rights movement, environmental rights movement, the civil rights movement. That was the meta frame. And this, if this kind of conservative wave continued, that would be the 1964 Goldwater defeat, would be, you know, the sort of the nadir of the conservative wave. And they are now, we're guessing that we're just past the peak of the resonance of the worldview. Again, I don't want to just, you know, sort of confuse this with actual campaign success, or this is really like when you know you can say something and you're sort of paddling down the river, that people go there with you. And the conservative frame is really one of individualism, security, and values. And part of the thing that I think is really important about this, that is that there are different organizing strategies and tasks at each point in where your worldview is resonant or not. And one of the pieces that is true is that when your frame is most resonant, getting aspirational policy goals and having mass mobilization is the easiest. So it's not a coincidence that Bayard Rustin and others, you know, were able to organize a march on Washington, get a gazillion people at the height of the rights frame being resonant. And you know, one of the things that movement folks say, that at least in terms of LGBT rights, and we keep framing our stuff in rights language, which doesn't necessarily resonate, that it's actually a miracle that we've been able to do and sort of as much as we have over the course of the LGBT rights movement, most of which has happened after the decline of that worldview being resonant. Does that make sense? And so part of what where we are at this moment, and I can't remember, Lisa, if you were saying that today or earlier today, so forgive me if I'm repeating what Lisa said, but you know, we're just sort of, at least folks think we're just past the nadir of the last progressive wave, and which means we're just at the beginning of the next progressive wave. And there are two things about that I want to share with you. The first is that the important task to be doing at this movement moment, and that is the really important work at creating and chewing over what the next worldview and frame is going to be. And doing enormous amounts of base building and trying to cast the net as widely as possible. And more social movement theorists are really talking about the fact that something around interconnectedness, interdependence, a lot of us have been talking about intersectionality, and it really is an opportunity for us to redefine who the we is. I mean, there's all kinds of wonderful things that have really come from this frame of human rights. But one of the downsides in terms of across progressive organizing is the fact that that has led to rather narrowly defined identity politics that make it really hard to be doing intersectional work. And for some of us whose very bodies fit in several of the boxes of identity, it makes it hard to find a place in the movement. And what happens is we end up in an us and them organizing strategy. And so your political action is us and our allies. But part of the suggestion here is if the we is more broadly defined, it's not me and you as my ally, but it is we share these values, we share this movement. The we is we, not me and you as my ally. So I'm going to leave that here, and I know that Lisa's going to do a lot more work on that next time around. Yeah, good. Next slide. So just a word of introduction for this next chunk of stuff that I want to share. And that is that there are lots of different types of organizing. I just kind of put up 3. And I know that Suzanne and Paulina did some really good work with you all around relational organizing. I want to just say that folks familiar with agitational organizing, there's a lot of Saul Alinsky, kind of Alinskian style organizing is really rooted in this philosophy. And I think Suzanne and Paulina said this, and I just want to repeat it, that I think that there are appropriate times to use a variety of organizing styles. And so doing good analysis and figuring out what kind of organizing to do in what context is really important. I would say that the vast majority of the work that I do is in the nonviolent direct action and relational organizing side of things. And so that's really what I'm going to be addressing. Again, the whole sort of nonviolent direct action stuff kind of harkens back to that Gandhian and Jesus stuff that I was talking at, and tends to be the primary strategy of the work that we do. But it's really rooted in this desire to form relationship and do relational organizing. And so the rest of what I'm going to do is really focused on relational organizing. So I understand that one of the questions that folks really wanted me to address was this question of having difficult conversations. And I think the specific example that was given to me was, okay, I'm a secular progressive person here in West Michigan, and I want to have conversation with really conservative religious folks about some social justice issue. How do I have that difficult conversation? So that's at least through the filter of either what folks said or what I heard, that's one of the questions. And I want to give credit where credit is due. This schema, and again, I just want you to know that this took me hours to form this PowerPoint slide. This comes from Keith Crone, who for a number of years, more than a decade, was the head of the BLGT program for the Unitarian Universalist Association. And when I first saw it, it blew my mind, and it's such a simple concept. The concept is this, that whenever the Unitarians go into a local congregation that wants to do a welcoming process, Keith requires them, or at least highly suggests, that they do an analysis of where people are on a scale of 1 to 4 in terms of their support of LGBT issues. This kind of schema can be used in any context, but a kind of developmental schema of ones being super, super supporters, and he sometimes even draws a sort of colored in bullseye in the middle of the people who are like so excited they can't stand it but have to talk all the time about it. And then 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, sort of between 4s being pretty dead set against a process. And his philosophy and organizing strategy is this, that you never ask people to have conversations or do organizing with folks whose numbers they don't touch. So 1s are only allowed to talk to 2s. 2s are only allowed to talk to 1s or 3s. 3s are only allowed to talk to 2s or 4s. You sort of get the idea. And I think part of our problem as progressive activists is, and I'm laughing at myself, but you're so earnest, you're so on fire, and you want to run out and go and have conversation with people who are completely opposed to you, whose culture you know nothing about, and you want to convince them that what you believe they should believe. And so, and as I say, I am that earnest person, but I don't know how many conversations you've been involved in, but they always suck. It's just a disaster when and people get mad or they don't talk or whatever. So, is that clear? Good. Yeah. Okay, next slide. So the other piece that's kind of coupled with that is that, again, I'm talking mostly about the context of doing this kind of relational organizing in the context of an ongoing community, in my context, a church community or a synagogue. But I really think that there are definite parallels with working either in other communities or geographical communities. And the piece that I want to, sometimes people are taught sort of one-on-one visits in political contexts. And as I've talked to my campaign organizing colleagues, I realize that the kind of one-on-one that I'm talking about is different than the kind of one-on-one visits that, that are sometimes trained in some campaign contexts. So just let me be perfectly clear about the kind of listening that I'm talking about. And it kind of goes back to the kind of Gandhi and Jesus stuff that I was talking about earlier, but the theory is that before one talks, that one does a lot of deep listening. So and it's the kind of listening is to be deeply curious. In my context, I would say is like, what is God trying to do in my life with that person? Like what are their core values? What is their humanity? And also like, what is their, I don't know if people know Frederick Buechner has this great quote that vocation is where my deepest passion meets the world's deepest need. And that's what vocation is. So like, what is the vocation of this person who I have the privilege to be listening to? Nell Morton has this great story of really, this is early in the second wave feminist movement. She was trying to figure out what she meant or wanted to say, and she was in a room where every single person were totally quiet, focused on her, and just deeply attentive and listening. No one said anything. And she talked about the way in which she was listened into speech. That the way in which being listened to can be this revolutionary experience. And just one concrete example of that, and for those of you who were there this afternoon, I apologize, I'm going to tell the story again. I'm looking in particular. One of my favorite stories of this is sort of, there's relationship building in this, but there's also an opportunity for transformation that you offer to the person you are listening to. And a concrete example of this was a Lutheran church whose church council was trying to figure out whether or not it was going to start, in the Lutheran tradition, they call it reconciling in Christ, but a welcoming process in their congregation. And if any of you have been to council meetings, you know that they can take a long, long time. And there was a P-flag mom and a young, early in his 30s dad, straight guy, who just butted heads. And this came up 3 different times across 3 or 4 different months of church council meetings. Should they even explore starting a RIC process? And the P-flag mom was, let's do it. And the straight dad was, no way, we're not going to do it. And at the end of like the third of one of these butting heads, the P-flag mom had this sort of insight, and she said, you know what, could you come next week and meet me in the narthex, the area sort of off the sanctuary? Could you just bring some pictures of your family? And so they got together the next week, and she came with her one picture of her family with her gay son and his partner, and he showed up with a grocery bag filled with pictures. And of that hour that they spent together, like 55 minutes of it was him pulling picture after picture after picture and telling her story after story after story. And she just listened and asked questions and was present to him. And then at the end, she got to share her picture. But what she found out was he wasn't like this hardcore bigot. He was a young dad with 3 kids who was exhausted and freaked out about being a dad and being able to provide for his family. And he was afraid that if they did a welcoming and affirming process, the support from his congregation would move from him to focusing on LGBT issues. Now we can question where all of that came from. But the experience of being listened to, and she ended up being a kind of mentor to him. She was an older mom and had been through raising kids. And it didn't completely transform him. He didn't become a P-flag member. But he did, the next time at the council meeting, step aside when it came time to vote about whether or not they were going to do the process. And he was able to at least get himself out of the way to have the process proceed. Now, she didn't say anything about LGBT issues, right? She simply listened and heard deeply who he was and sort of sat down next to him in solidarity with him. So that's just one concrete example of the ways in which this kind of relational organizing can be deeply transformative. All right. So we have another time for both writing, and I'll be interested to hear if you all actually write, and then a little bit more conversation at your tables. So, next slide. So, I'd like you to consider how the kind of three phases of power, the mass mobilization, infrastructure building, disseminating a worldview, and this kind of movement waves, and some of the insights around having difficult conversations. How does all of this kind of theory relate to your work in your community? And so I think there are two pieces to do on your own. First of all, if you can have a specific, concrete community or group of folks in mind as you're writing, that would be really important. Specificity helps. And then, do a little writing or reflecting on your own, and I'll tell you when 5 minutes is up. And then I'd invite you to take 15 minutes this time to talk at your table. Is that clear? Great. Invite us to bring our many conversations into one conversation. All right, so this last section of our time together this evening is giving you an example of moving from some of the theory into what might you do to craft a plan in your local community for action. So again, I'm using a concrete example and it's going to be uploaded into Piggly Wiggly, something that's called Building an Inclusive Church. And pretty much everything that I'm sharing from this point forward comes almost directly out of that curriculum and guide. So I would recommend it to you. But the piece that we are often called in to help congregations through a welcoming process. And people often start with an educational process, like if I just tell you the facts, then clearly you'll get it and change your mind and support this. And part of all of what we just talked about really leads us to say, well, the actual process itself is really important, but perhaps even more important than the excellent factual video that you're going to share is the organizing that happens prior to the start of the educational process. And I think there are lots of parallels in terms of community organizing as well. And so I cannot overemphasize the importance of what may feel like preparation, so we use a number of tools for assessment and analysis and preparation. And I'm just going to very briefly talk to you about them. But again, they are covered in much more depth in the curriculum. And we actually do 3-day trainings to teach people the skills to implement these kinds of tools. So the first is sort of the notion of assessing the readiness of any particular community for the educational or change process that you're trying to introduce. In our assessment, we do things like, there's lots of evidence that shows if a congregation has had a woman pastor, they are much more likely to be open to LGBT issues, for instance. So there's a 27 question assessment, and at the end, a congregation is scored, and depending upon the score they get, they are, don't you love this, they're either Saint Adventurous, Saint Moderatus, or Saint Cautious. But this is nothing. This does not say anything about the likelihood of their going through a process. But what it does indicate is the speed with which the process will go. So rather than spending, some congregations literally from start to end, it's like a 6-month process. The longest congregation I've ever worked with, 10 years. So luckily, the average is usually more like 2 to 3 years. But again, it helps you get a sense of what your strategy is going to be, depending upon how long it's going to take and what sort of care you need to take with each step along the process. The second piece that I think is really critical that we often miss is doing a kind of historical analysis of what the community in which you're working, what they have done around conflict in the past. One of the things that specifically around LGBT issues, one of the things that I am chagrined when I'm called into a congregation that has had an experience of clergy sexual misconduct in its past, and it blew the congregation up, and either that or they completely clamped down and people left but nobody talks about it, and they have a really sort of dysfunctional system around talking about anything that's even vaguely related to sexuality. That means that we are in a lot of trouble and have to do a lot of work ahead of time so that there's not a conflation, as you can imagine, with all the crap from the past and the process that we're attempting to do. So that's just an example of really understanding sort of what has happened in a community. The next piece that's really extremely important, and again, both in terms of communities that are ongoing, like church communities, and geographic communities, is a pretty good power analysis and mapping. And this is talking about the formal leadership. So here at the university, who are your trustees? Who's the board? Who are in the elected formal positions across the community? But then who are the beloved professors or the influencers? Or, in my context, we talk about the pillars of the church. And it doesn't matter what the church council says. If Mrs. Jones isn't on board with this, you are screwed. And, that kind of sense of, the informal leadership is often more important than the formal leadership. And having a good analysis of both of those pieces is critical. So, having done that kind of analysis, the other piece is, as you have captured, I hope, thus far, that this kind of model is really values-based and encouraging people to act rooted in their own values and trying to resonate with the values of other folks. And so one of the most important pieces, and again, this goes back to the third face of power, is it's critical to do some analysis of what are the core values of the community or organization in which you are working. Who do they say they are, and who do they say they want to be? A good example of this is, so funny, tonight all my examples are from Lutherans, but there's this Lutheran church in Columbus, Ohio, that has they are all about the hospitality. When you walk in their front door, I kid you not, they have a barista. And, like for lattes and cappuccino and all that, in their lobby. So the first thing that you get is, do you want that, single tall, whatever. They are all about the hospitality. And they had the experience of the Columbus Gay Men's Chorus came to, they rented out the church space, and the men came for rehearsal. I don't know if it was the week before or whatever, and they walked into the door, and as you can imagine, a number of them were nervous about being in a church context, given their history, and they were met with, what kind of coffee can I give you? And after the rehearsal, numbers of them reflected to church personality, leaders, that the impact of walking in the church door and not being met with hatred, but in fact being met with, what can I get for you? You are welcome here. Well, how can I give you exactly the right coffee? Was the church leaders were overwhelmed with like, well, of course, that's what we do. But it was such a powerful experience for them to see what kind of impact that kind of hospitality could have on folks, that they literally almost immediately embarked on a reconciling Christ process. And as you can imagine, the frame that they chose was hospitality. So that gives you a sense of, it's really important to kind of choose things that resonate with the core values of the community. Next slide. So this is, you know, we talked earlier about the kind of deep listening that is kind of the bedrock of this kind of a organizing strategy. And there are times to be using a kind of listening campaign, so at different stages of the process. And there's one is to use it very early on. Part of the piece that we really talk about is you never, ever, ever try and do organizing by yourself. The critical importance of forming, we use the language of core team or coalition, but you can use it to just get to know people in your community. And I think one of the pieces that might be really interesting for you all is to think about doing some one-on-one visits with one another post this experience to get a sense of, you know, coming to know one another more deeply and figuring out where there might be some synergies of work together. So you can do this deep listening early on in the process to get a sense of who are my peeps and who's the coalition that I'm working with. You can also do it sort of a bit more into the process. You know, I don't want to go too far down this road, but this whole piece about making sure that the definition of the kind of change that we're looking for is as broadly defined and includes as many people as possible. And if you could be using this technique to do some deep listening and figure out, you know, we talked about, for instance, the experience around the Proposition 8 campaign in California earlier this afternoon. And, you know, one concrete example is, you know, what if when we thought about who is the we that is impacted around marriage laws in California and elsewhere, what if the we at least included straight folks who were elderly, who, you know, who were widowed or widowers, and whose Social Security was impacted around, you know, around marriage laws? And what about immigrants, you know, for whom marriage laws are deeply important in terms of immigration status? And as well as LGBT folks. So, you know, that's just one concrete example about if you can be listening about, oh, so I see how this and this are connected, and it helps you be expansive around defining the we, and so that there's a way in which the strategy and approach is deeply coalitional, and the we is much more expansive. Okay, next slide. So all of this is all in preparation before the actual sort of action or campaign or process happens. So when you actually do the campaign or the process or the action, so you're working in the midst of people that you love and trust and have done, you know, deep listening with and been listened to, and you've broadly defined the we. And then, I mean, this is hopefully flows from what I've already said. You craft a frame based on the core values of the community in which you're working. And you set a time frame that's based on your assessment of what the readiness of the community and how long it's likely to take to do a process. And then you want to be finding ways to engage in culturally competent and appropriate educational activities and actions. I just want to share a couple. Again, the complexity and richness of religious organizing. The Minnesota Council of Churches, a couple of years ago, as we were debating a budget in our state, that, you know, it actually, this budget this year makes that one look like child's play. But just slashing and burning, you know, basic services that, you know, would literally mean life and death for people in our state. Their frame was that budgets are moral documents. And they're council of churches, so, you know, a Christian organization. And, you know, one of the things that people in church love to do is sing. And so they crafted an action at the state capitol where we went to the nearby church, and there were probably 300 of us. We rehearsed for 2 or 3 hours this fabulous, you know, music from a variety of the community's traditions within our state. And then we went to the state capitol and we stood on the steps and we had a mass choir, we had a concert, and then we went in and lobbied our legislators. And there was a way in which, you know, we were singing about what we believed, and we were doing something that is, you know, indigenous action to people who are church people. And then we were, you know, taking that worldview and sort of, you know, what we do that's culturally competent, and then we were taking the mass action. And I can't tell you how much fun it was, and how proud I felt to be the person I was, and how congruent the action that I was asked to take was with who I am as a person of faith. Another example was an event that I went to around the whole Proposition 8, No on 8 campaign in California, was organized by Jim Lawson. I don't know if folks know, Jim was one of the, and continues to be, just one of the pillars of the civil rights movement. African-American Methodist pastor, was held in his congregation. And it was a gospel concert, so very much rooted in the African-American Protestant tradition. And they had, at the beginning, they had presentations. So you got all the education, and when you walked to the door, there were people taking down your name and doing the, as our campaign colleagues call IPVR, in-person volunteer recruitment. So you had all those sort of, you know, campaign things that were happening, but it was in the context of preaching and praying and singing in very culturally competent ways. And people were on a high at the end, and they were ready to take on the Proposition 8, you know, issue. So that's another concrete example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so the last thing I want to do tonight is just give you much of what we have talked about thus far has been mostly rooted in deep listening. I wanted to share with you one particular technique, which I understand some of you have actually already been trained in. So hopefully repetition will help with deepening as opposed to creating an opportunity for being bored. So I'm just going to go over this technique, and we're not, unfortunately, have enough time to actually practice it, but I do have one concrete example of someone who I think is a brilliant example of how you do this technique. So in much the same way that listening is a core piece of everything that I have shared, another core piece is that you're listening for someone's story. That there's a way in which crafting our change movements around the power of narrative is extraordinarily effective. That, you know, there are lots of people who, you know, who are writers, talk about the power of narrative. But it's extraordinarily important in every social justice movement, the power of storytelling and grounding it in the particularity and moving from sort of the head to the heart and the gut. And it's one of the things that it's really important is to help us in the public square humanize, and it goes back to that sort of Gandhian and Jesus stuff, that not only are we listening and looking for the humanity in others, we're providing opportunities to be seen for the full humanity that we are. And so the strategic storytelling allows for that opportunity. Great, next slide. So I think I've said a lot of this already, but I think we know that when you go to a lecture that's completely fact-based, and something that I've learned as a preacher all the time is you never, ever, ever just tell the facts, ma'am. It's always in the context of narrative and stories, because that's what fosters relationship. And there's a way in which you tell your talking points, but they communicate the value and the emotion, not just the intellectual part of it. And there's a way in which, I know we've all experienced it, that you can come away from hearing someone's story transformed and inspired and just ready for action. And I feel like I'm telling you things that you already know. Go on to the next slide. The piece about this particular tool, the strategic storytelling, is that rather than saying, the reason I want this non-discrimination law is because it's bad for people can't get jobs. And you go through like the 3 or 4 talking points that campaigns spend enormous amounts of time crafting. And money. There's a way in which you embody them in your story, and people get the talking points without being sort of, it's a more circuitous route, as Emily Dickinson would say, so you go around, I can't remember exactly how she puts it, but that there's a way in which it's able to land in a softer way and people are able to kind of take it on. It moves things from the abstract to the concrete, and as I say, it fosters relationship. And one more slide that makes the point. Wow, how'd you do that?
That was hot.
Wow. I did not plan that.
I don't know.
I have no idea how it happened, but there you go. When you go in to learn this technique, it's really important to kind of break it down and get an understanding of how you tell good stories. That there's always a moral or a point to the story, that these particular stories in strategic storytelling are as specific as possible, and that you want to have a plot. You want to kind of move through a plot to get folks engaged in what you're saying. And more specifically, next slide, in this particular technique, you really want to craft your story around what is the challenge, what is the choice, what is the outcome. So let me just give you one example of one of the stories that was told to me as I was learning this technique. There was an 80-year-old United Methodist woman who tells a story that when she was 5 years old, her mom used to have the job of being in the congregation and cleaning the sanctuary. And every week she would take this young 5-year-old and she would take the chalice, the plate, and the cup off of the altar and put it on the front pew. And then she would dust and clean. And this young 5-year-old girl, one day, was standing with her back to the altar and on the front pew, lifting up the cup and pretending that she was the minister. And in the midst of doing that and sort of mouthing the words, she felt these 2 hands on her shoulders. And in that instant, she knew that she had been busted by the pastor who caught her pretending to be the minister. And he leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Always remember that God loves you." And she said, "And I have spent the rest of my life making sure that my church lives up to those words." So that's an opportunity, that's an example of the challenge was, it was actually for the minister, the kid holding the chalice up. She was a girl and she was a child, both of which in those days she wasn't supposed to do. And he had the choice of either, smack her upside the head and shaming her, but he, instead of making that choice, he decided to teach her a word about extravagant welcome. And the outcome is that she spent the next 75 years of her life being an advocate for change in her church. So that gives you a concrete example of challenge, choice, and outcome. Go to the next slide. So the technique is really, I don't know how long that took me, but usually they're supposed to take about 2 minutes for each of these 3 parts, for a total of about 5 or 6 minutes. But the point is that you are able to craft your story where you tell your story of self in much the way that this woman did, that has a challenge, a choice, and an outcome. And then you connect your story to the larger community, like who are we together? And what does it mean to be part of this community together? And then, again, challenge, choice, and outcome. And then the story of now is you know, in our political colleagues often talk about urgency, you know, creating an atmosphere of urgency. But what is the greatest challenge facing us together today to make it critical for us to together do this action together, and what might the potential outcome be? So that's the technique. And as I say, Colette and I were talking about how usually this would take, you know, at least 3, maybe 4 hours to teach the technique. But rather than being able to teach the technique, I'm going to show a brief clip, and I want to say a couple of disclaimers. I trust that this is a nonpartisan context. I know that we come from a variety of political traditions. But one of the best examples of this technique, and I want to give credit, it really was developed by Marshall Gans. He spent, I think, about 20 years working with United Farm Workers, and he now teaches at Harvard University as a professor there, and it's really his work. And it's come to me through now Reverend Dr. Tiffany Steinwert, who's a Methodist pastor, who teaches this, teaches now at Syracuse University as their dean of the chapel there. But the best example that we continue to have of this technique is Barack Obama's speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. So I hope that if you have defenses around Barack Obama or love Barack Obama, you can kind of try and lower that and be curious and be aware of the technique itself, okay? Now, just give me a second to try and pull up the technology. All right, here we go.
Born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats, went to school in a tin roof shack. His father, my grandfather, was a cook, a domestic servant to the British. But my grandfather had larger dreams for his son. Through hard work and perseverance, my father got a scholarship to study in a magical place, America, that shone as a beacon of freedom and opportunity to so many who had come before. While studying here, my father met my mother. She was born in a town on the other side of the world, in Kansas. Her father worked on oil rigs and farms through most of the Depression. The day after Pearl Harbor, my grandfather signed up for duty, joined Patton's army, marched across Europe. Back home, my grandmother raised a baby and went to work on a bomber assembly line. After the war, they studied on the GI Bill, bought a house through FHA, and later moved west, all the way to Hawaii in search of opportunity. And they too had big dreams for their daughter. A common dream born of two continents. My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation. They would give me an African name, Barak, or Blessed, believing that in a tolerant America, your name is no barrier to success.
So he's moving from self to us.
They imagined me going to the best schools in the land, even though they weren't rich, because in a generous America, you don't have to be rich to achieve your potential. They're both passed away now. And yet I know that on this night, they look down on me with great pride. They stand here, and I stand here today, grateful for the diversity of my heritage, aware that my parents' dreams live on in my two precious daughters. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. Tonight, we gather to affirm the greatness of our nation. Not because of the height of our skyscrapers, or the power of our military, or the size of our economy. Our pride is based on a very simple premise, summed up in a declaration made over 200 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the true genius of America. A faith in simple dreams, an insistence on small miracles, that we can tuck in our children at night and know that they are fed and clothed and safe from harm. That we can say what we think, write what we think without hearing a sudden knock on the door. That we can have an idea and start our own business without paying a bribe. That we can participate in the political process without fear of retribution, and that our votes will be counted, at least most of the time. This year, in this election, we are called to reaffirm our values and our commitments, to hold them against a hard reality, and see how we're measuring up to the legacy of our forebears and the promise of future generations. And fellow Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, I say to you tonight, we have more work to do. More work to do for the workers I met in Galesburg, Illinois, who are losing their union jobs at the Maytag plant that's moving to Mexico, and now are having to compete with their own children for jobs that pay $7 an hour. More to do for the father that I met who was losing his job and choking back the tears wondering how he would pay $4,500 a month for the drugs his son needs without the health benefits that he counted on. More to do for the young woman in East St. Louis and thousands more like her who has the grades, has the drive, has the will, but doesn't have the money to go to college. Now, don't get me wrong. The people I meet in small towns and big cities, in diners and office parks, they don't expect government to solve all their problems. They know they have to work hard to get ahead, and they want to. Go into the collar counties around Chicago, and people will tell you they don't want their tax money wasted by a welfare agency or by the Pentagon. Go into any inner city neighborhood, and folks will tell you that government alone can't teach our kids to learn. They know that parents have to teach, that children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth with a book is acting white. They know those things. People don't expect government to solve all their problems. But they sense deep in their bones that with just a slight change in priorities, we can make sure that every child in America has a decent shot at life. And that the doors of opportunity remain open to all. They know we can do better. And they want that choice. In this election, we offer that choice. Our party has chosen a man to lead us who embodies the best this country has to offer. And that man is John Kerry. John Kerry understands the ideals of community, faith, and service because they've defined his life. From his heroic service to Vietnam, to his years as a prosecutor and lieutenant governor, through 2 decades in the United States Senate, he's devoted himself to this country. Again and again, we've seen him make tough choices when easier ones were available. His values and...
I'm going to stop it now, but I would like to just Can't figure out how to get that down, so I'll just turn the lights on.
Can you maybe just minimize it? Because we're really done with the... So first of all, tell me, did you discern, we were just getting to the story of now. I stopped it because it was going on a lot about John Kerry, and that was sort of a little bit off topic because of what he was meant to do. But tell me, do you remember what was the challenge, choice, and outcome in terms of his story of self?
Where his parents were from.
Right. Yep. And what was the choice that they made? And what was the outcome?
Come to America.
What's that?
To come to America.
Yep.
Education.
Yep. And what was the outcome? Do you remember some of the, they believed in me because they believe in an America where, you know, that whole series of, how about the story of us? What were some of the challenge, choice, and outcomes? Did you notice those? It's getting late, people are getting tired. But did you feel how it's, you know, see the speech in its totality, did you feel how you were drawn in to and sort of engaged emotionally? I mean, there was the talking points of the Democratic Party there, and you know what their hopes were for the election. But it was deeply personal, and you know clearly he's gone on to continue to use this technique. But I would really offer it to you when it comes time to craft your. I'll just give you one example of where it's being used currently. The United Methodist Church, every 4 years, has its general conference, and it makes all the rules for itself for the following 4 years. They have 1,000 voting delegates, and most of those voting delegates are kind of repeat delegates. Oftentimes people are delegates for 2 or 3 times. And the Reconciling Ministries Network has taken this, the pro-LGBT organization within the United Methodist Church, has taken this technique, and it has trained, well, at this point, they're close to 1,000 people. And each of those 1,000 people have agreed to meet with at least 2 voting delegates, once before the General Conference and once after the General Conference, and use both the deep listening and the strategic storytelling to try and humanize, because as I don't know if folks know, but my colleague Troy Plummer, who's the head of the Reconciling Ministries Network, talks about the United Methodist Church is the meanest, officially the meanest church out there, in that anybody can be denied membership simply for being LGBT, let alone being a pastor and all of that. But that's a concrete way that they are using this technique to try and build relationship, because again, the delegates are going to be delegates for a number of years. So it's not just a one-on-one visit with them before to try and convince them and then be done with them, but using this listening and storytelling both before and after General Conference. Just one concrete example. All right, well, I want to move into the last piece for this evening, is to take, where it says change you, down at the bottom, there we go. Excellent. Nicely done, thank you. Can you do the next slide? One more. So what I would like you to do is, let me see about the time here. I'd like to leave enough time for us to have some concrete question and answer time. But what I would like you to do is at least begin. Whenever we do trainings, we usually spend 2 or 3 hours on this next piece, which is concrete action planning. Like, how do you take this stuff and go home to your congregation or your local community and actually do something with it? So what I would like to do is, I would invite you, and it sounds like maybe this is a room of more extroverts than introverts, because it seems like the quiet writing time was much shorter and the conversation time was much harder to stop. But I would invite you to take some time to reflect on your particular community, and about 5 to 10 minutes by yourself, and then I would like to ask you to move into group discussion for a good 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and following these questions. So again, concrete example of what community you're talking about and thinking about, and then take the reflection and the conversation you've had in the first 2 discussion periods, and how might you apply this assessment, listening, and storytelling skills that I've sort of laid out to your particular community in order to, craft a plan of action. And kind of further on that, what are the holes? What's the further training and exploring you need to do before you would feel equipped to actually sort of launch off into action? Is that clear? Okay. So I have about 8:25. So what I'd like you to do is take about 10 minutes to about 25 of, and then take another 10 minutes to about quarter of, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes just having some question and answer and making sure that things are clear. I see a question in the back.
I'm not clear in point number 2, what the first 2 questions are.
So the answers and the sort of the reflection that you took from the first 2 reflection times, the first 2 small group activities that we had, namely, what's your experience within and with organizing within and with religious communities, and then the second reflection time, what is the concrete application of this kind of theory of the 3 faces of power, the movement building, and the having difficult conversations. So take your answers from those 2 reflection periods, add them to some thinking about the assessment and the listening and the storytelling skills, and sort of think about all 3 of those things together. How might that lead you to at least begin to craft an action plan for your particular community? Is that clear? Okay. All right, go. And bring them into one conversation. I wanted to take just a few minutes before we say goodbye to one another to have some kind of basic question and answer time. And I just wanted to share one concern that Gordy raised before he left. And that is, he was concerned about this technique being used in manipulative ways. And he asked that I kind of lift that up and say, and my response was, in fact, 2 things. One, there are some folks who teach the kind of listening technique in blatantly manipulative ways. Like, you're listening so that you can get the other person to do what you want them to do. I mean, and if you look on different groups' websites, that's their stated purpose. And so he and I were having a little bit of conversation about, for me, that's one of the key roles of the core team, that not only are they your sort of your peeps and the folks that you do your work with, they're also your community of accountability to help make sure that the work that you all are doing collectively is really rooted in you choosing to use your power for good, and really doing the kind of listening for genuinely seeing the humanity in others and genuinely doing the storytelling to reflect your genuine values. And so I just wanted to, he asked as he needed to leave that I lift that point up. So I just wanted to say that. Other questions that came to folks or at any point in our time together this evening? Pushback? Yes.
I do. I don't know if it really ties into this, but I think it's interesting you showed that number of 4,000 churches who say they're affirming. And I don't know if I can put you on the spot, but what do you really believe are really affirming?
So the question was, at some point I used the statistic, there are about 4,000 welcoming and affirming congregations. And the question is, can we be real? How many of those are actually affirming congregations? So I would say 2 things to that. One is that like in the United Church of Christ, they're celebrating their 25th anniversary of being, the open and affirming program. So it's been a long time. And I think that part of the pieces that we have recognized and we're trying to work in relationship with congregations is that being welcoming and affirming is a process, it's not a destination. So that with the passage of time, it means different things and people have to sort of stay current and do continuing ed, as it were. So I would say that for about 75% of the congregations, it means that they have done genuinely good work around gay and lesbian issues. And that some of them have done some exploratory issues around bi and trans, but that part of the work that we're doing with those congregations and the sort of denominational programs that work with them is this whole piece of, we're O&A, now what? We're doing really intentional work, particularly around transgender bisexual issues, and the other piece is that for particularly religious communities, the welcoming and affirming stance is, and statistics, bear this out, that there's a very clear affirmation of the welcome and the affirmation of folks to membership and to religious leadership, but that does not always translate to full support of marriage equality. So I think there's just like any other kind of organizing, coming to know what that really means in each local congregation, but at least as a sort of baseline of a relatively safe space, I really think that it's fair to say that most of those congregations are in fact some modicum of a safe space.
The only reason I bring that up is because we had an interesting conversation about so many of these churches say that, but they kind of implement the don't ask, don't tell.
So I would want to know about those congregations, because we actually only list congregations on our website that have had sort of independent verification that they are in fact welcoming and affirming. Because there's a lot of congregations that, we totally love LGBT folk, come on in, we'll teach you how to stop being that. So we have a very clear criteria of independently verifiable. So I would really encourage you to utilize sort of those lists that are independently verifiable. And for what it's worth, we have a list on our welcomingresources.org lists by state and zip code, all the congregations around the country. Yeah. Other questions or pushback? Yes?
I just want to distinguish if there's a difference between affirming and accepting.
Absolutely.
So there's churches that say that they're accepting, but they're not affirming.
That's right. Tell me your name.
Ashley?
Ashley is making the point that there's a huge difference between affirming and accepting. And again, I would again talk about the part of the independent verifiable criteria is making sure that when people do a process, it really is affirmation and not, grudging acceptance. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
With storytelling, I went to a training through Church World Service earlier this year about social media and the use of video and storytelling, and I think that they were really trying to. They were doing this campaign, Reform Immigration, and it's called the New Year's Resolution campaign, and it didn't really take off. So they were kind of trying to piggyback on some of the, why can't I not think of this word, of the, anyway, they were trying to piggyback on the it gets better.
Oh, yes.
Campaign. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. They were depending a lot on people to first film their own videos, and second to like share it with their friends, and I think that that's a really good way to do it. But with this one in particular, it didn't really go very far, and I think that it has a lot to do. Like you need to have a very compelling story. You can't just be sitting in front of your bookcase and just being like, I care about this because this, and this. It's really important that the story to have all of those components that you were talking about, and I think that's something that we're missing in a lot of those.
Yeah, and I think the other piece to lift up is, I cannot overemphasize the way in which practice is really important, and that because part of the piece is helping you get the challenge, choice, and outcome, but also helping you hone it down to, in some ways showing the Obama speech was a bad example because it took him 16 minutes. And really you really want to be able to do it in 5 to 5.5 minutes, all three of those parts. And so I think compelling, emotionally grabbing, and honed. It really is strategic. Yeah. Anybody else? It's hard for me to look to my right.
I'm not sure who it was that was just speaking, but they mentioned social media, and that's actually something that we talked about when we were talking about the mass mobilization, that social media both helps and hinders that, because there is the whole idea of you can reach out to a lot of people.
Yes.
But there is also the other part of that where people are like, oh yeah, I support that.
Click.
Click. I don't, I did my part.
Right.
So what are some of the challenges, but also the positive parts of social media and some of this movement building that you're talking about?
I think it's a great question. In some ways, it's somewhat rhetorical. I mean, I think I would encourage us to hold that as a question. But again, just like we were talking earlier about sort of agitational and nonviolent direct action, relational organizing, that different contexts require different action. I also think making a discernment, part of the relational organizing, and I feel like an old fuddy-duddy when I say this, but in some ways I'm a Luddite in that, I do think that there is a portion of relational organizing that you just simply cannot do except when you are in the same physical space with people not on their BlackBerries and actually talking and listening to one another. That being said, I do think that part of the mass mobilization, for instance, that when you get to that phase, there's a lot of the social media stuff is fantastic, and also some of the dissemination of worldview. Some of the social media stuff is fantastic for that as well. And so I think it's just a good, again, sort of as part of this analysis, when can you utilize the strengths of social media, but not, to your point, pretend like you've sent an email and therefore you've done relational organizing. Does that, I don't know if that... Well, in many religious traditions, they say to say thank you is the most important prayer. And so I say thank you to all of you for giving me your attention and open hearts and minds. And I just look forward to hearing about all the outrageous trouble that you're about to engage in. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Another hand for Rebecca. We would love to hear from you. You have some just iridescently green evaluation sheets. They probably glow in the dark, but please take a moment to fill those out. And we'll see you next month on April 14th for our final Change You session with me and Minkus. And we love Lisa. Wonderful Foods. Thank you, Lisa, also.